Tenicca, what was it like growing up to womanhood having your disability?
I did not think much about my leg as a child because my father never mentioned it, and also because there were no children living near us with which to play. It did cause me pain on occasion, but that just seemed a part of life I had to bear. Worse were my nightmares about the war. But as I grew to maturity and began thinking about myself as a woman and entertaining thoughts about men and about love, my leg began to become an obvious impediment to me. I realized how unattractive my stiff leg and severe limp would be to a man. I began to wonder if it would ever be possible for me to marry. The darker these thoughts became to me, the more I threw myself into learning everything I could from my father. If I were to never have a husband on which I could rely, I would have to rely on my own abilities, and if I were never to have children to care for, love and raise to adulthood, I would have to find something else to give my life meaning. I began developing a great interest in my father's business and in his great understanding of the gem trade. He seemed pleased to teach me in the absence of any son to whom he could pass down his trade. The more I learned, the more I began to respect my father and the profession he had built. In time, he also began to trust my own skills and understanding. We became trusted business partners as much as we were father and daughter. It was a much slower, more difficult process, however, to develop professional relationships beyond my father. The fact that I was a woman disturbed many of our clients. It was one thing for my father to have his 8-year-old daughter underfoot in his shop, and an entirely different matter for him to defer haggling over the price of a ruby to his 18-year-old daughter, who should have already been married and pregnant with her second child. And because I was a far more shrewd bargainer than my father, that truly flustered them. But in time, they forgot about the sex I was born with and came to value me as a trusted colleague.
How did your interest in Nahor transition from professional to personal?
My interest in Nahor, or Shamir, as I knew him. At first I took him to be nothing more than an adventurer, a gadabout. He was preoccupied with something that seemed to me more mythical than real. But he also seemed more open and honest than most men I knew. I was shocked when my father, having spoken with this man less than an hour, made a deal with him to be my bodyguard, mouthpiece, and constant companion on a 2-year voyage to the farthest east. The man seemed to have a single-track mind concerning his great quest in life, and my father was now trusting him with my care. And my life? I was stunned. I suppose my father was so desperate to make one final and great trade to cap his career that he was willing to risk even his daughter. But this was my father's business, the crowning achievement of his life, and I was merely his daughter. My tutoring relationship with Shamir had a rough start. He did not seem very eager to learn, but I confronted him with that and his demeanor began to change. After a time I began to understand he was quite learned and had been very successful in his original profession. Our relationship as tutor and pupil grew into an amiable one, but it still had its challenging moments. Sometimes the man could be so thick-headed, but in time I realized that what I first took to be ignorance was often merely his concern for me as a woman. During the long voyage, my relationship with Shamir progressed. From pupil to bodyguard to business partner to confidant, I came to treasure his ready wit, his tender ways toward me, and his inner strength. On the voyage home, some of the parallels of our two lives brought us together in a profound way. I felt our hearts melding into one. I could no longer imagine my future without him. In those last months, we experienced together precious, tender, and powerful moments, the depth and beauty of which one can only dream. And in the end, I suppose it showed itself to be nothing more than a dream. In shocking fashion, he left me standing on the docks at Musiri. His explanation of why he was leaving me seemed nonsense at the time, but after months of grieving my loss of him, I came to understand that he was probably right. There was a nagging, dark hole deep within him that I could have never filled. We may have enjoyed a beautiful season of bliss, but sooner or later he would be compelled to leave me, searching yet again for whatever it was he believed he needed. And if that had happened, I would have been left in an even more devastated condition than I was on those docks that day. When he left, I must have waited on those docks for hours, until my lame leg finally gave way and I collapsed in a heap. I wept long and bitterly. Finally, I pulled myself up to sit on one of my trunks. With the sun falling to the horizon, I looked down at my right hand, still clenched in a tight fist. My fingers had been clenched so long, it took my other hand to pry them open. In my palm was the silk bag of pearls belonging to my father, and 4 loose pearls, Shamir's hire as my bodyguard. I nearly cast them into the river, but after weeping once again and crying out in rage, I placed them for safekeeping in my baggage. They would be some tiny consolation for the loss of the last 2 years and a shattered heart.